Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar brought to you by sharedserviceslink and sponsored by Vertex. Today, we're going to be looking at where are your hidden costs and lurking VAT compliance risks. My name is Sarah Fain, and I am the head of content at sharedserviceslink. And I'm delighted to be joined today by my panelists, Peter Boerhoff, the VAT Director at Vertex, and Roger Lindelau, the Director of the SAP Center of Excellence at Vertex. You, of course, have a very important role to play in today's webinar as well, and that is just to make sure that you get the most out of this hour. Peter and Roger are absolute experts in this field, so please take this opportunity to ask us your questions. We often get questions about the slides. These will be sent to everybody who has registered for the webinar. And just to preempt some questions, that the recording will also be available on sharespace.digital. We'll be sending the CPD certificates. Those will come from the team at CPD, usually at about 28 working days of the webinar. And one of the best things you can do if you like our content is, of course, to engage with us and our sponsors, but like and share it on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And we have another little special thing for you, is that we are giving away $175 or your currency equivalent in charity to a lucky listener who stays on to the end of the webinar. So we'll be checking timestamps at the end. So please do stay on, ask your questions, be engaged, and be in with a chance to donate to a charity of your choice. So just to touch a bit on the context and the agenda for today. If you're on the line today, you'll probably be aware that the indirect tax landscape is changing really dramatically at the moment. But finance and tax professionals often find they have a lot working against them. Despite being one of the biggest investments a company may make, ERPs are just not necessarily built with tax in mind and often aren't fit for purpose when it comes to determination of complex VAT transactions. So people are having to pay quite a lot to customize SAP just to get it to handle indirect tax correctly. We often see now also that with the real-time reporting requirements, more than ever, indirect tax compliance is a cross-functional effort. So you'll be needing data from all sorts of data across the finance and procurement processes. And if this is scattered without the right technology in place, without the right data in place at the right time, it's getting more and more difficult to ensure compliance. So with these factors in mind, companies are finding there's actually a lot of hidden costs and hidden risks in their organization. So we did a survey recently with Vertex to start talking about these, uncovering them, and what we can do about them. Just to give you a sense of who took the survey, these were about 80 respondents who are mostly in Europe, but scattered across the world as well. And we had a cross-section of finance, indirect tax, and other. Other included shared services, general management, or people whose maybe job title made it a little bit unclear. But so generally a mix of finance and tax professionals. So I would just like to get into our first poll question here before we get into the data. And that is, we want to understand, do you think your ERP is able to handle your company's VAT processes? So would you say that you are confident your ERP is able to handle your company's VAT processes? Would you say that there are some capability gaps, but you have a solution to fix them? Would you say there are gaps and you're trying to find a way to fix them? Or would you say no, you don't think your ERP is actually able to handle it and you don't necessarily have a plan to fix these? So again, to what degree are you confident your current ERP is actually able to handle your VAT processes? So very confident, you're aware there's gaps, you've got a plan, no plan, or no, and you're a bit lost in the woods here. So great to see lots of you voting, and I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1, and the results are coming up on your screen now. Most respondents here in the middle, 13% say, yep, we're confident in our ERP's ability, but most people are aware there's some gaps. So half of you say there are gaps, but you have a solution. 38% say there are gaps and you're looking to find ways, but none of you say that you just don't know how to fill these. So let's take a moment then and compare to how that compares to ours. So actually it was pretty close in terms of the trends. That some of you, 23% of our respondents said that they were confident their ERPs are able to handle their VAT flows and tax determination. Similar to the survey today, about half of you and 46% of our audience recognize the gaps but have solutions. And then we get into 28% said they're gaps and they're trying to find ways, and 3% said they just don't know how to fill the gaps. So Peter and Roger, I'd like to bring in you here to see what resonates here with you. And if you could speak a little bit about to what these capability gaps are.
Yeah, let me start briefly, and Roger, please chime in if you have a different opinion, and also if you agree. One of the first things that crossed my mind when I saw these percentages is that we really have to understand that not everybody in finance and not even in tax are at the same level of understanding the real nitty-gritty details of a VAT process. That understanding is quite often in the indirect tax function, so that can be in finance and in indirect tax. If you talk to a generic corporate income tax manager or a financial controller, those have different kinds of understanding of a VAT process than, let's say, I would say the indirect tax experts. So that was one. And the other one is that my initial thought was, well, okay, the 23% that are confident about their ERP, that percentage is relatively high. But then I thought, well, okay, as an indirect tax lawyer and practitioner, I always had the inclination to focus on the problems. So you get a biased perspective of what is wrong and what goes right. And at the same time, also not every business is complicated. Yeah. So it also is from where do you come from. So that's my initial thought.
That is what I fully agree to. It's really depending on how complex a company is, how well your ERP is handling your VT process. If you only have flows with one or two with two parties in the flow or so, then you very often see that the VT treatments should be simple, and you could actually handle that with your normal ERP system. If I look at results, and first of all, the VT processes, I think that is quite a broad area. There's a lot of things that fall under VT processes, reporting, but also transactional processing, analysis, audits, etc. I'm more a specialist in the determination area, so I normally focus on that. If I look at the transactional processing in the ERP systems, like sales orders, like billing documents, like process AP invoices, direct finance postings, etc., and we see basically all the financial platforms that are out there, if it is an Oracle system or an SAP or Microsoft system, Coupa, if you're talking about AP scanning solutions, etc., there's normally only a basic functionality available for VT determination. Out of the box VT determination is therefore in the majority of the companies not possible without sometimes heavily investing and enhancing the functionality as provided by those financial platforms. And that is what you also see back in the service results, I think, where less than 25% of these companies are comfortable that their platform actually can handle VT determination. And like I said, the majority of those companies understand there's a gap in the functionality, which we can clearly see back in the survey. More than 75%, if I look at the survey, needs to enhance their system to really become compliant.
And I think, go ahead, Peter.
Let me add to that, Roger, because we also tend to focus on the sales process. Yeah. But if you look at AP and procurement, that's way more difficult to automate. That's a very heavy manual process from a VAT perspective, quite often based on decision trees, process descriptions, and like I said, manual processes. So I could also imagine that people have a clear understanding and or at least feeling that also there are capability gaps and people would really like to have that automated to a much greater extent.
Yeah, fully agree. Yes.
Rajat, this may be too much of a big question here, but with these gaps, you know, they aren't secret, and companies like SAP will kind of know that they don't have the capability that a lot of these companies need. Is there a plan at companies like SAP to start addressing these that you know about?
Yeah, we'll also talk about that later on during the webinar with one of the other slides. But I don't think that there is any financial platform out there. If it, again, if it is SAP or an Oracle or Microsoft or whomever is providing those financial platforms, what you now also see with marketplaces and so on, they don't really provide you with a new tax determination solution. It will always be a basic solution that they provide with, because there's such a complex area and everybody has his own views on VAT and everybody has his own modifications in the system, etc. We'll talk about that later again. But it is almost impossible for those platform providers to facilitate VAT complexity for each and every company that is using the platform. And that is where you see there's quite a gap in solving those issues for the companies. And I don't see, therefore, any plans in those companies to really come up with a new sophisticated solution.
Well, thank you. So what I'd like to do next is go to the next survey point that we discussed, and we asked our audience whether they actually track the cost or the time of the following processes that actually do take up quite a lot of time and resource related to tax compliance. So I know there's a lot to take in on the screen here, but you'll see if people take yes, we do track this, that'll show up in the green. No, we don't track this, that'll blue. And then if they're maybe not sure, in the yellow. So we asked people if they're actually tracking the time it takes to gather the data and preparing that related reports, whether they track the time and cost of maintaining IT systems to ensure compliance, whether they track the time of reconciling VAT due to commercial numbers and other VAT reports, training finance team, monitoring transactions to ensure compliance, and things like fixing tax code errors to ensure compliance. So I think what stands out here is that actually you'll see, it's less than half of people are tracking these, and the most people are generally tracking the data gathering, preparing VAT related reports, and they're least likely to be tracking fixing tax code errors to ensure compliance. So it'd be good to get your input on this, Peter and Roger. How does this kind of resonate with you, and does this generally correlate with what you see in the market?
Roger, can you go first?
Yeah, I want to go first. I was quite surprised to see the results when I saw the first results from the survey, because whenever we normally talk to companies about if they are tracking costs, because every company which we talk to want to have a business case for change. They want to understand how will this solution, if we build a solution or buy a solution, how will that be paid back? So the return on investment they want to understand. And then very often we ask them, yeah, what are you doing as a cost for maintaining your system? And they very often say, we don't know. I've not encountered more than one or two companies in my life that really said, oh, we have a clue about what it costs. They normally don't track that. So I'm quite surprised to see that so many people say that they are tracking the cost. And then I'm putting some question marks in there if they really track the cost. If I look at the results, I think that the majority, and like you also already said, is tracking the cost in the reporting and the training and the reconciling and the monitoring and the fixing of the errors. And that is probably also the most easy part to track cost, because they are normally very visible areas and they have dedicated resources spending their time on this. But if you look at, for example, the tax determination, the maintaining IT systems to ensure compliance, if you then take the VAT determination part of that, that's far more difficult to track. Those areas where they are really tracking what the costs are, it's quite easy to track, but it's also quite easy to reduce by fixing the root causes of these issues found in the monitoring and analysis task. What I unfortunately see is that most often those companies try to fix the issues by spending a lot of time and efforts in the reporting process. So they are putting a lot of tools into the reporting process to detect errors and fix them then, trying to, for example, automate the fixing of the reporting issues, rather than to spend the time and effort in fixing the root causes of those issues. And that is enhancing, for example, the VAT determination process in their financial platforms to reduce risk on making mistakes in the VAT determination. So implementing, for example, a tax engine to prevent issues from happening rather than to later on fix them during the reporting process. And I see that trend very often, that people are really fixing the reporting issues first and then look at trying to fix the root causes. And I'm not sure if that is the right way to look at this. Peter?
Yeah, I had exactly the same perception, Roger. First, your initial comment for me also was spot on. I recognize that completely, that if businesses are in need of a business case, they want to outsource or automate, they start or try gather this data. But if you're in an immediate conversation, then typically this data is not available, according to my experience. And if you look at, well, okay, what is then being monitored, and you question whether, let's say, that's the right priority, I for myself basically created a priority based on these results. And my number one would be indeed maintaining your IT system to ensure compliance, because this is your fundament. This is where your processing happens. So this is the core of what you should be able to fix. And that's independent of discussions about having a business case, capturing low-hanging fruit first, gathering data, etc. It's just a matter of priorities. And my number two would be, let's say, monitoring transactions to ensure compliance. And the reason for that is that if you do not monitor, you won't find the errors, and then you do not have anything to fix. So that automatically comes to number three, and that's fixing the errors to ensure compliance. You first need to monitor before you can fix. And that's all to basically to ensure your fundament of tax calculation is correct. And then in number four, it's data gathering, preparing, and filing VAT reports. Although it's a legal obligation, you have to do it. It's only, let's say, and I say only between, I should say between brackets because I'm a tax lawyer, but it's the output of your system. And of course, that's the visible part for tax administrations, but still, if you say, well, okay, where should we track our costs? I would say this is number four. And then number five is the reconciliation. You want to match up your numbers. And yeah, for training, that's for me, that's number six. Quite often this is kind of a black hole. And if you do a training, people remember it, if you're lucky, for about a week, and then they forgot all about it. So that's really supporting the rest. So that would be my my sequence of priorities, basically, to track these costs and see where you first need to improve.
Well, thank you both. I think that really highlights some of the areas where people online today, if you're not tracking some of the ones you could be focusing on. So what I want to do next is first get a little bit of a pulse check from people in the audience today, and we'll be sharing our results in the survey as well. Essentially, what we're asking here is kind of upstream of tax. How well are you capturing the correct tax codes and tax relevant data from sales and invoicing processes in finance and procurement? I think I might be missing a word there, but essentially upstream of tax in finance, sales, procurement, how well are you capturing tax codes and tax relevant data? Would you say that you do well with your current controls in training to capture everything? Would you say that you mostly get it right, but with a small degree of error? Or would you say that perhaps you are often having to fix mistakes or VAT-related disputes? So it'd be great if we get a few more of you voting. So again, did you say you do well with your current controls? Would you say you mostly get it right with a small degree of error? Or that you're often actually having to fix VAT-related disputes? I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Just about half of you voting, showing those now. So nobody on the line is saying that you're often fixing mistakes. So it's kind of a quarter of you said that you do well, but 75%, so 3/4 of you mostly get it right with a small degree of errors. So I'll do now is I'll just share with how that compared to our survey results. So again, we asked the same question to our audience, and we had a quarter, similar to you, said that you do well with your current controls. About half said you mostly get it right with a small degree of error. And in our audience, 21% admitted to having often having to fix VAT-related disputes. So it'd be good, Peter and Roger, to hear what you think about how this resonates with what you see in the market as well.
Yeah, what I first would like to say is that if you look at capturing tax codes and resolving VAT disputes, that's in a business, and especially in a global enterprise business, it's quite operational. And let's say higher finance and tax management is often not even aware of the amount of effort that's put into these activities. It's completely invisible for them. And what worries me the most is the high percentage, actually in both polls, in the online poll, but also in the overall results, about we mostly get it right with a small degree of error. Because first, what's a small degree of error? That's the first one, of course, but a small degree of error, from my experience, can already result in quite a significant hit when you're audited for VAT or indirect tax. And this is especially true if the audits are systemic. So if they are built into your system or as a result of specific master data. And there are a couple of components, but this has to do with the fact that VAT processes in a business, they cover both accounts receivable and accounts payable. So you have to add them up from a risk perspective. And the other thing is that tax auditors often audit a single year. So that's still the traditional audit. And they use the outcomes as being valid for multiple years. So let's say 3 to 5 years. And as a result of this, the VAT hit in a tax audit can easily be 5 to 10% of your annual margin with only a 1% error rate. And 1% is not that much, so it can be quite significant.
That's true, Peter. Yeah, if I look at the survey outcome, it indeed matches what I typically see if I'm talking to the customers. I mostly get the answer that everything is fine and under control, and that's very often based on the fact that we recently had an audit and no serious issues were detected. And that unfortunately doesn't always reflect the reality. I've performed in my life dozens of risk reviews already in large ERP systems and uncovered many topics that needed attention. And in my experience, most of those risks and issues go just undetected because they are very difficult to spot. It's quite difficult to really investigate into your data. Problem, however, is that the tax authorities, in my opinion, are getting far more intelligent nowadays. And they use technology and real-time data, think about e-invoicing, bill clearing and so on, e-reporting and so on, to investigate into your transactional data. And that intelligence at the tax authorities will only increase, if you ask me. They are actually also hiring SAP consultants. They are putting AI and machine learning in place, etc., to really detect if that data makes sense that you send to the tax authorities, and will spot far easier those issues and problems in the system.
Great.
Actually, yeah, maybe if you then also want to see what can you then do as a company. So yes, we think that we are fine, but what can we really do to then investigate if we are really fine? So like Peter said, yeah, it's maybe 1%. That could be big, but I think a lot of things are not spotted. I think if your company is not sure if the system is really set up correctly or not, I think they should ask for an advice. And that could be a full risk review. If you have the time and the budget for that, then you could do, of course, a 3 or 6 month risk review, look through all your data. But you could also do a kind of a quick scan. And Peter and I discussed this, I think, a year ago already, to start offering that to customers to do a quick scan, come in for 1 or 2 days, ask some questions, do some interrogations together with the people that really know how the system is working. and then discuss those topics that we regularly see in creating the topics that normally create a high VAT compliance risk in a company. And that is not really time consuming. Like I said, it could be a couple of days, but it could give you already good indication if you have any possible risks, or it could also confirm that you indeed have minimal risk and you don't have to do much about it. So that's some of the options that you have to really investigate if you are running risk. Yeah, I don't know.
Great. Yes, I think anyone on the line, if you are interested in kind of those quick scans, please do get in touch with the team Vertex. Again, yeah, these are some of the experts in the world, so I would reach out to them if you're interested in that. So I just want to also touch on our last data point here, and we asked our audience, kind of moving forward, how well do you understand the solutions that your company could be using to handle your VAT processes? So the options we gave them is whether they understand that their ERP, tax engines, perhaps other bolt-on technology and applications for tax, or outsourcing VAT reporting. So you can see here in the dark blue is people who said, yeah, we understand this well. The light blue is I somewhat understand, and the yellow is I'm not very familiar with. So you can see this is in descending order of people who said where they're most familiar with how their company could use these tools, down to 64% with their ERP, down to only 20% saying that they understand outsourcing VAT reporting well. So Peter and Roger, I'd just like to turn over to you to see how these numbers kind of firstly resonate with you, and if you could talk a little bit perhaps about the pros and cons of some of these as well.
Roger, ERP is first, and you're the ERP man, so.
Yeah, I'm a really ERP man. Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I'm surprised again that 64% says I really understand the solutions that my ERP system have embedded to solve our VAT processes. If I normally just ask a simple question like, do you know how your legal partner for VAT purposes is determined in your ERP system? And people very often don't even know the answer to that very simple question. So I'm quite surprised to see that that people think that they really understand well what an ERP system can do for them. But I think that also comes back to Peter, like I said, if you are higher up in the organization, you very often don't see the details, and you very often perceive the ERP system as a system that can really help you in VAT determination. But like I said in the beginning, they very often just only provide you with basic functionality, and you still need to enhance that yourself. I'm happy to see that 1/3 actually understands tax engines, because tax engines previously were always like, yeah, those are things for the US. That's nothing for the rest of the world. That's actually not true anymore. That was maybe true 25 years ago, 20 years ago, but nowadays tax engines are really global. So that's my first impression of these figures.
Yeah, I'm aligned with that, Roger. I've had many discussions with my previous IT departments about how ERP works, and I was very happy that I had a few people, let's say, in between me and the hardcore ERP people that could make kind of a translation of how things works, so that I, as a tax lawyer, could also understand it, because it goes really deep, and there are even yeah, let's say, and you're pretty aware of it, there are specialists for each component in an ERP system. So there are special material master data specialists, or sales specialists, or whatever, and specialists for the finance modules within ERP. So there are very few people that have, at least from my experience, a complete insight in, okay, how does a transaction, how is it processed in an ERP system, let's say end to end. And I would like to, let's say, focus a little bit more on the bottom of the diagram instead of the top, because I was also surprised by, let's say, the relatively low number of people that understand outsourcing of VAT reporting, because outsourcing of VAT reporting for businesses is quite a normal activity. It happens a lot. If people businesses have a foreign VAT registration, quite often the reporting in another country is outsourced. Corporate income tax compliance is quite often outsourced. So yeah, I was a bit surprised that people that understand that is a relatively low number.
You would expect it would be the other way around.
Yeah.
ERP should be at the bottom, and outsourcing VAT reporting should be at the top.
That would be my expectation as well, Roger.
Oh, great. Well, and I guess there might be some survey psychology here that people may be saying they want to say they understand something well, and the ERP, particularly with finance people, might resonate with both. But I think, like you said, when you scratch under the surface, whether they really understand it, that might look a little bit different if you ask a bit more in-depth follow-up question. So just thanks so much for your input on this. So I'd just like to hand over to you to talk a little bit more about how to kind of move forward with this, and talking here about a bit more of the processes, systems, people and organizations around VAT determination and tax.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. If you look at, let's say, some of these results, it's quite heavily systems oriented. It's answers and questions based on the capabilities of ERP and what kind of automation solutions do you know further. But if you look at, let's say, VAT and the VAT or indirect tax function in a business, it's a composition of processes, systems, people, and then how do you operate? How are you organized? And they are all connected. So the way how you design your process, also the question whether you put processes first or whether you say, well, okay, we start with our people and our capabilities, is already a very basic discussion. But the generic agreement with peers is that, yeah, all of these components are equally important. And what systems cannot do, you have to solve with people. But it's the same with what people do, you do not have to solve with a system. So it depends on where are your priorities, but also how do you structure your organization? Do you have a decentralized organization with finance and tax operations in multiple countries and finance and tax reporting in multiple countries? Or do you have that all centralized in a number of regional shared service centers? That has a significant impact on how you structure your process, what systems you need, and also where your people are located and what the available skills and capabilities are. Let's, for example, take language. If you have everything within the country, language is less of a challenge than if you say, well, okay, we have one global shared service center, and they should speak Greek, Chinese, and Portuguese at the same time, which is more of a challenge. And next to centralization, you can also say, well, okay, what part of your process do you want or do you need to outsource? And that can be a core finance process that you outsource to, let's say, a generic finance business process outsourcing organization, or it can be really dedicated outsourcing of your VAT compliance. And it's important to get this total picture in order to evaluate, well, okay, what are my system capabilities and where do I invest and how do I prioritize? Yeah, what's also important to understand, my takeaway from, let's say, the questions and also the responses is that it's quite, let's say, a current perception of where we are. So it's how are we capable of managing the current VAT process. But we should definitely not ignore that we face an increased need for speed, and we should prepare for the future. And this future is already now in some countries and regions, like for example LATAM, but also Italy, and because of real-time reporting and e-invoicing mandates, the time to correct errors in your compliance process at the end, that time, that space for opportunity to make corrections, that will disappear in the near future, and is already disappearing. And that also implies that your VAT controls will have to move from, let's say, the traditional reporting, where people did checks and quality controls when preparing a VAT return, to really have the controls embedded in your transactional environment. So as soon as you make a sale, or as soon as you book a purchase, or even already when you procure, you need to be able to determine the VAT, the applicable rate, the applicable tax codes, etc., etc. And because this is going to real time, you can also no longer rely on the effort of people. They simply do not have the time to react. So this implies automatically that there is much more need for automation as well.
Yeah.
So that's what I would like to add to, let's say, the overall picture. So it's first, well, okay, where are you focusing on? People, systems, processes, and your organization. And second, don't only look at how it's going right now, but also have a clear perspective on what's coming in the near future.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really good idea just to how to kind of focus people's energy. And so Roger, again, our resident ERP expert, would you be able to just give us a bit more information about why is VAT in SAP just extra complicated?
Yeah, and that's really coming back to some of the survey results again. Is there any plans, for example, for an SAP system or any other financial system to build more sophisticated VAT determination solutions in the system? I think it is almost impossible for those companies. And why is that impossible? If you look at the VAT rules, if you, for example, look at the EU directives, that's already quite complicated. There's already a lot of rules in there. But those rules are not black and white. If you then look at the country specifics, if you could advance the slides, Sarah, I'm not sure if they are delayed yet. The country specific VAT rules, so like I said, the EU directives are not always mandatory. A country can pick and choose some of the rules to implement and then have their own vision on those rules. So that makes it quite complicated to embed those rules in the SAP systems. And you have an own interpretation of VAT rules. I always say if I put four big four consultants, for example, in a room and say talk about triangulation with customer pickups and these kind of things, then after a week, I guess probably I get still 4 different advices about how the VAT treatment should work in those flows. So everybody has an own interpretation of the VAT rules. It's not really black and white. And then an SAP system, but also an Oracle and Microsoft Dynamics, they don't have all the business processes predefined in the system. They don't have a template for each and every business process. So if you have a certain scenario, then you very often have to build that yourself. And that then depends on how you build that in that ERP system. And then next to that, you also have your own enhancements. So everybody is enhancing their SAP system and so on, their own coding and own user access and so on, like we call them in the IT world. And that all together creates quite a complex maze of how every company is looking at this. And if you look at the large amount of customers that are using these ERP systems, SAP has tens of thousands of customers that are using an SAP system, then it's almost impossible to implement a tax solution that should cover everything, and that should also cover all the own interpretations and own design business scenarios and so on in the SAP system. So I can't even blame any financial platform provider that they can't provide a really sophisticated VAT determination solution, because they would need to support 20, 30, 40,000 customers at once with the same issues. and that's just impossible. And that is where we are lucky that we don't get all those customers at once at our doorstep. We get them by bundles of customers, so we can still handle that. That's basically the answer to why do those financial platforms don't they have any plans to make this more sophisticated. If you then go into the second question, that was the last slide that we talked about in the survey. That is, do you really understand your ERP tax determination? If I look at SAP, SAP has, for example, in the sales, they have a VAT condition record technique, they call that. And that condition record technique has 3 access sequences, from quite simple cross-border, where we only look at the tax departure country and tax destination country, and based on that we determine a tax code, to quite more detailed tax departure country and tax destination country, but then also looking how is my customer classified for VAT purposes and how is my material classified for VAT purposes, and that would then lead to a tax code and a VAT rate. That is native SAP system functionality that is embedded in the SAP system. But then you see that companies can't handle their complex VAT flows with this condition record technique. So if you look at how customers then solve that, if you would go to the next slide, Sarah, then you see that customers create a variation on these conditions. And they create not only 3 access sequences, like we saw before, but they are creating 9, 10, 11 access sequences. My personal record with the company that I investigated was more than 100 access sequences, and they had more than 1 million condition records to determine the VAT. And then I wonder if you put all those characteristics, like I put on the slide, like a tax departure country, destination country, we saw them before already, but also maybe the sales order type and the division and the distribution channel, maybe the ship to, the sold to, the Incoterms, etc., etc. If you put that all into those condition records, then I wonder if there's any tax manager, and Peter, you have been a tax manager that looked at this, if you can really make sure that these condition records are all correct. And I guarantee you, if you have more than 1 million condition records, then there are quite some condition records that are not correct, and condition records start to bite each other. So you think you solved one issue, then you get the next transaction, and it takes the wrong condition record with the wrong tax determination. So that is really what I would like to also add to the survey results. I think it is almost impossible for tax managers to really understand how your VAT system works. And IT people are normally handling these condition records, but then I always put the question marks: are they really VAT experts, and do they really understand the consequences of dealing with the VAT topics in this type of scenarios and solutions?
Let me briefly add to that, Roger, from an operational perspective, because this is how the system is set up, but that doesn't imply that your accounting or customer service employees always follow that system. Yeah. I've also seen in practice that if a customer service employee thinks that a customer should get an invoice without VAT, they simply change the customer tax classification into non-taxable, and then they overrule basically everything that's programmed into this sequences. So you really want to eliminate those errors as well.
Yeah, so try to avoid all the manual corrections and corrections then in between brackets into the system. Yes, I fully agree. Try to automate that. And if there's a correction to be made to a tax treatment, involve a tax manager in that. So before just doing, yes.
Great. Well, thanks so much for those really great insights there. I think we've got a real kind of a pulse check now on where people stand and some ways to move forward. So before we go into Q&A, and again, just want to remind you, if you haven't yet asked your question, please do use the question functionality that's usually over on the right-hand side of your screen, and we can put your questions to Peter and Roger in the last 10-15 minutes here. But just want to wrap up again, just touching back on the survey findings, just with the data set as well. For most large organizations, we see that ERPs just aren't sufficient to manage VAT determination and processing, and many people who took the survey and people on the line here are still looking for ways to fill the capability gap. We saw that less than half of our respondents track any of the resource used or the cost of tracking many of the activities associated with compliance. So they actually may not be truly accounting for the cost of compliance. And that we saw, while most respondents are not very familiar with tax or bolt-on engines, to ERPs to help the tax compliance. So hopefully you've learned a bit more about what some of the capabilities and the way forward are. So with that, I'd like to start putting some questions to Peter and Roger. And again, you can submit your questions as well with the functionality. So probably again in ERP, I'm going to put this to Roger. We talked mostly about SAP in the webinar today, but is Vertex able to work with other ERPs as well?
Yeah, so we have connectors to all the large ERP systems in the world. So we have connectors to SAP, all the versions of SAP, but also to Oracle, also to Microsoft Dynamics, and a whole bunch of others. We have a whole connector team that's working on that. We're also working on APIs to make it easier to connect to other systems. We can also connect to even own built systems that very often together with the customer we build that connector, but we basically don't care which system is creating the transactions. We can do a tax determination for each and every system, also for marketplaces and these kind of things.
Great. And a question kind of around, maybe one for you, Peter, first. With tax kind of being increasingly cross-functional, is it natural that compliance should sit completely with the tax department, or is there maybe another natural owner for compliance, or should you have a cross-functional team? What's your take on what you see that works well when it comes to ownership of compliance?
First, you have to always define what you precisely understand with compliance, because there is a group of people that say, well, okay, compliance is the reporting function. And I am more of the position that compliance is your end-to-end process resulting in the reporting. So, and from that perspective, it's indeed, it's cross-functional. And what you typically see, that if you do not assign the responsibility of this end-to-end, let's call it the indirect tax process, to one single function, it's very difficult to ensure compliance, because every business is, let's say, under-resourced, or every function, I should say. So they all have to prioritize what they do first. And then if you have one boss managing procurement, and you have another one managing sales, and you as an indirect tax manager want to improve your compliance, it's very difficult to get that prioritized over their typical priorities. So you would really need to make sure that you have, call it a process owner for your end-to-end process, also with the right power of attorney to ensure this changes. So it also requires budget, etc. So it should not be a paper function, but a real function. But otherwise, it remains scattered, and it's very difficult to embed, let's say, the continuous improvements that you need.
Yeah, I think it is indeed a cross-functional function, but also you need to make sure that you also have good translators between those cross-functional functions. So a VAT manager very often speaks very well educated about VAT, with a lot of articles and a lot of legal sentences in there, but it really depends on if the IT person then really understands what the VAT manager is talking about. So I would say, yes, if you have a cross-functional function, you also need to have translators that speak both languages for each and every department, but you really can make sure that everything is well understood and nothing is lost in translation. So.
Thank you. A question just come in. I'm assuming this is about Vertex itself. The question is, does one single VAT system cater to the VAT requirements of all countries, or does it need customization / enhancements to meet the VAT needs of various countries?
Peter, do you want to answer, or? Because this is about global scale, I would say. From the
but I think it relates to the VAT system within a business. I would say, because if you look at the VAT regulations, we have harmonization within the EU, but for the rest, it's the rules are different per country or per jurisdiction. But if you move to, let's say, a single global ERP that has to manage all these jurisdictions, the question is really how do you set that up? How do you manage that?
Another question around it seems that the data is really key to meet these new requirements coming in, the right data at the right time. What impact does a system like Vertex have on improving data quality coming into the system?
Okay. If you compare that, for example, with SAP, you have, for example, material tax classification to indicate what kind of an VAT treatment should be used for a certain sale or purchase of a certain material or service. And that's very often in the hands of material master data teams, which are not really VAT experts. You just need to always make sure that that is correctly handled. With Vertex, we don't use those identifications anymore, also not the customer tax classifications. We handled it in a different way in the Vertex system, and that is where then the tax manager becomes more in control over that master data, rather than master data teams that are not really VAT experts. So that is one part where we take that away. Of course, also VAT registration laws, especially in the European business, are really important to manage that. We have some functionality to really check up on the VAT registration numbers, even worldwide. If you think about marketplaces and so on, we have solutions that can worldwide check if we are dealing with a business, yes or no. That is also very important. So also that data needs to be corrected. But yes, I fully agree. Without correct data, you don't get a correct tax determination. That is with any automation that you would put in place. Incorrect data will sometimes lead to incorrect tax determination. Peter, maybe something to add?
Yeah, what I've been in a couple of these discussions where I was pushing for, let's say, for tax automation to improve the processes and to improve compliance, while people in the business used bad data as an argument to not make that investment. And my counter argument was always that apparently in the past decades that we used SAP, there has never been an incentive to ensure that the master data was correct. And the burden of, let's say, incorrect master data was always with the finance people that were at the end of the process doing the VAT reporting, identifying the errors. And my aim with automation was always to ensure that the error occurred and the correction had to be done at the location where it happened. So if you process an incorrect sales transaction, the basic should be that it is stopped because it's a non-compliant transaction. And of course, you need to have escapes because sales need to go on, but it should not be that all these errors continue through your system and end up in your reports. That cannot be the purpose. So I always say, well, okay, you can also use automation as a lever to improve the data rather than waiting for the errors.
Great. All right, well, it looks like this is probably our last question coming in, and then we're near the hour anyway now. So a question is, does the Vertex VAT solution cover the import scenarios and processes for various countries?
It covers the import scenarios for VAT, but it does not cover the import scenarios for customs duties and excise.
Okay. Great. Well, I think you've given everybody a lot of information to digest. And again, I think if anybody is interested in the quick scan solution, I think that's a really great call to action to move forward with your organization. So please do get in touch with Team Vertex. Respond to the email. We'll put you through when you get the slides. Just let you know we have a few other webinars coming up, and we've got a lot of content we've been producing with Vertex this year. So we hope to see you at one of those, or you engage with some of our lovely content. Again, we'll be picking one of you lovely listeners on the line now for a charity donation. So yes, you will get a copy of the recording, and we just like to thank you again for your time today. You've all been great. Thank you for your thoughtful poll questions and responses, and thank you again to Peter, Roger, and the team at Vertex. You're always lovely to work with, and great to see you on the line today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.